I still remember that frigid, unsettling hour when the silence of the night was shattered by a phone that rang incessantly, and as I reached for it with trembling hands, I discovered that the caller ID was mysteriously hidden, which immediately filled me with an inexplicable sense of dread because I had not dialed any number, yet there I was, answering a call that seemed to emanate from the very bowels of despair. The voice on the other end belonged to a 911 operator whose tone was uncharacteristically quivering with alarm, and she inquired repeatedly if I was in imminent danger, all the while a slow, ragged sound of breathing could be distinctly heard in the background, intensifying the eerie ambience that enveloped my entire existence that night, leaving me with a deep-rooted conviction that something inexplicable and sinister was orchestrating these events beyond my control. I sat alone in my dimly lit living room, my heart pounding in syncopation with the relentless drip of anxiety that had now firmly taken residence within my chest, and as I tried to comprehend the bizarre occurrence unfolding before me, I began to scrutinize every minor detail of my surroundings, questioning every subtle sound and every fleeting shadow, because the notion that an unknown presence was manipulating the very air I breathed was both terrifying and utterly surreal, and with each passing second the atmosphere grew increasingly suffocating as if the walls themselves were closing in to trap me within an inescapable web of dread and uncertainty, leaving me paralyzed with the overwhelming realization that the boundary between my reality and an uncharted nightmare was blurring beyond recognition. I reluctantly decided to retrace my steps and search for an explanation, all the while grappling with the disquieting possibility that the inexplicable call was not a mere technical glitch but rather a deliberate and malevolent intrusion into my life, and as I scoured my phone logs and attempted to piece together the fragments of the chilling encounter, I could not shake the oppressive sensation that I was being watched by an unseen force, whose presence manifested in every creaking floorboard and every distant murmur, compelling me to confront the horrifying truth that my life had just been irrevocably altered by a mysterious and relentless presence that sought to haunt my every moment, leaving me with the unshakable fear that nothing would ever be the same again. I tried to convince myself that it was just some kind of bizarre glitch in the system, some inexplicable but ultimately harmless error in the vast, tangled web of telecommunications, yet no matter how many times I told myself this, I couldn't shake the gnawing unease that had begun spreading like poison through my veins, the sickening certainty that something wasn't right, that something was profoundly wrong, and the realization that I was now part of something I could neither comprehend nor escape left my stomach knotted with dread. My fingers trembled as I navigated to my phone's call log, my breath shallow and uneven, and yet, as I scrolled through the list of recent calls, I found nothing, no record of an outgoing emergency call, no indication that I had ever dialed 911, and yet the ringing voice of the dispatcher still echoed in my mind, the urgency in her words, the fear laced in her tone, the unmistakable sound of someone else breathing on the line, someone who wasn't supposed to be there, someone I could almost feel lingering just beyond the reach of my perception. I clenched my jaw and forced myself to exhale, the silence of my apartment now heavy, suffocating, pressing in on me like an invisible weight, and then, just as I was about to put the phone down, I heard it, faint at first, almost imperceptible, like the rustling of fabric in a distant room, but as I strained to listen, the sound became clearer, the unmistakable rhythm of slow, deliberate breathing, and in that instant, every hair on my body stood on end as I realized the sound wasn't coming from my phone anymore. It was coming from inside my apartment. For a moment, I didn't move, barely even dared to breathe, my body frozen in the kind of primal terror that paralyzes prey just before the predator strikes, and the only thing I could hear was the rhythmic, unbroken inhale and exhale of someone unseen, someone impossibly close, someone who should not, could not, be in my home, yet was undeniably present in the suffocating darkness that surrounded me. My mind screamed at me to run, to get out, to throw open the door and flee into the night without looking back, but my body refused to obey, as if some unseen force was holding me captive in that moment, trapping me in the unbearable stillness between logic and absolute horror. The sound of breathing did not waver, did not pause, and yet no matter how hard I strained my eyes, no matter how much I willed my vision to pierce the shadows of my apartment, I could see nothing, just the dim outline of furniture, the faint glow of the streetlights leaking through the curtains, and yet the feeling of being watched, of something standing mere feet away from me, was as real as the blood pounding in my ears. Then, without warning, my phone screen flickered, the display distorting into jagged, erratic lines, and as I watched in frozen terror, letters began appearing one by one across the screen, typed as if by unseen hands, spelling out a message that sent a wave of cold panic crashing over me. Who answered? The words burned into my mind, a question that shouldn't exist, a question that implied something I couldn't even begin to comprehend, and before I could react, before I could even attempt to process the sheer impossibility of what I was seeing, the lights in my apartment flickered violently, plunging the room into pitch-black darkness for the briefest, most agonizing second of my life, and in that instant, I felt it. A shift in the air, a presence that was suddenly closer, so close that I could feel the icy breath of something unseen against my neck, and as the lights snapped back on, the room around me was unchanged, untouched, exactly as it had been moments before, and yet I knew, without a doubt, that I was no longer alone. I stood there, my breath caught in my throat, frozen in the eerie silence that followed the sudden blackout, the lingering sensation of icy breath on my skin still prickling my nerves like needles piercing through flesh. The room around me was unchanged, the furniture unmoved, the walls intact, yet the air was different now, thick with an unseen presence that made my skin crawl with an overwhelming sense of being observed by something that had no right to exist in this world. My eyes darted toward the hallway, that narrow stretch of darkness leading to my bedroom, a place that had once felt safe but now loomed before me like the gaping maw of something waiting to swallow me whole, and as I forced my trembling legs to take a step forward, a noise, low, deliberate, unnatural, rose from the silence. A slow dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled across the floor, echoed from the shadows at the far end of the hall, and the realization struck me like a bolt of ice through my chest: I was not alone. My mind raced, screaming at me to run, to get out of the apartment, to put as much distance as possible between me and whatever thing was lurking just beyond my line of sight, but my body refused to obey, rooted in place by an unshakable terror that gripped every fiber of my being. Then, in the dim glow of the streetlights filtering through the hallway window, I saw it, a shadow, tall and distorted, stretching unnaturally along the walls, its shape shifting and twisting as though it were something not entirely human, something that didn't belong to this world. My chest tightened as I realized that the figure was not moving like a person would, it swayed, its elongated form flickering as if struggling to maintain its presence in this reality, and though I could not see its face, I felt its attention locked onto me, a suffocating weight that made my stomach churn with the primal knowledge that I had been noticed. The sound of breathing returned, deeper this time, reverberating through the silence like a monstrous exhale from the void itself, and then, before I could react, it moved. The shadow lurched forward with unnatural speed, gliding toward me without the sound of footsteps, its form warping as though it existed outside the rules of this world, and in that moment, sheer instinct took over. I staggered back, nearly tripping over the edge of the couch, my heart hammering so violently I thought it might tear through my ribs, and just as I turned to flee toward the front door, my phone, forgotten in my panic, began ringing again. The shrill sound cut through the thick air like a knife, and in that fraction of a second, my blood ran cold, because as my eyes flickered toward the screen, I saw the caller ID, 911, displayed once more, but this time, beneath it, a message burned into the screen in stark, undeniable letters: "Do not run." My breath hitched in my throat as the piercing ringtone of my phone echoed through the apartment, each shrill note cutting through the silence like a serrated blade, and yet, despite every primal instinct screaming at me to run, to escape, to get as far away from this nightmare as possible, my eyes remained locked on the glowing screen, the words, "Do not run," burning into my mind with an intensity that made my head swim with nausea. My fingers trembled as they hovered over the screen, torn between answering and letting it ring, but deep down, I knew that if I ignored it, if I turned my back on that message, something much worse was waiting for me in the shadows, something that had already crept closer while I was frozen in place. The air had grown thick, almost syrupy, pressing against my skin like an unseen force, and just as my thumb grazed the answer button, the atmosphere shifted, a subtle but undeniable change, like the moment before a lightning strike, when the entire world holds its breath in anticipation of the storm. I pressed the phone to my ear, expecting static, expecting that slow, rattling breath from the first call, but what I heard was far worse. It was my own voice, distorted, warped, layered over itself in an eerie, overlapping chorus, like multiple versions of me were speaking at once, whispering in a frantic, jumbled cadence that sent ice cascading down my spine. Don't turn around. Don't look. Don't move. Don't breathe too loudly. Don't let it know you can hear me. The whispering voices weren't just warning me, they were pleading, and the sheer panic in their tone made my blood run cold because it meant only one thing: whatever had been watching me, whatever had crept out of the darkness and into my home, it was here now, standing so close that I could feel the shift in the air, the barely perceptible change in pressure as something loomed behind me. I wanted to close my eyes, to block out the reality of what was happening, but my body refused to obey, locked in place by a fear so overwhelming that it felt like I was drowning in it, and then, I felt it move. A whisper of breath, impossibly close, grazing the back of my neck like something leaning in, tilting its head, observing me, savoring the moment before it would finally make itself known. I clenched my jaw so tightly it felt like my teeth would crack, my lungs burning as I fought the urge to gasp, to scream, to bolt from the apartment, but the warning on the phone still rang in my ears: don't turn around. The sensation of being watched was unbearable, the weight of its unseen gaze pressing down on me like a lead blanket, and then, slowly, deliberately, it reached for me. I didn't see it. I felt it. A cold, skeletal pressure brushing against my arm, a sensation so foreign and unnatural that every cell in my body screamed in protest. The phone slipped from my grasp, clattering to the floor with a sharp crack, the sound breaking the suffocating silence like a gunshot, and in that instant, the thing behind me laughed. It wasn't a human sound. It wasn't even laughter. It was wrong, fragmented, glitching through different octaves, a garbled mess of sound that shouldn't exist. And before I could stop myself, before I could control the instinctive horror that took over, I turned around. I wish I could say I didn't turn around, that I had listened to the desperate warning from my own distorted voice on the other end of the call, that I had kept my eyes locked straight ahead, unmoving, unflinching, resisting the pull of curiosity and primal terror that threatened to consume me whole. But fear does something strange to the human mind, something uncontrollable, something primal. My body moved before my brain could stop it, my neck twisting, my gaze shifting, my vision dragging toward the darkness that loomed behind me, and the second my eyes met it, my world cracked open. It wasn't just a shadow, wasn't just some shapeless entity lingering at the edges of my perception, no, it was a shape, a figure, a mockery of something human, stretched and distorted, its limbs too long, its fingers gnarled and twisting like exposed roots, its head tilted at an unnatural angle as though it had been broken and never properly set back in place. But the worst part, the part that made my breath stutter and my stomach drop into a pit of ice, was its face. Because it wasn't some monstrous, nightmarish visage pulled from the depths of some horror movie. No, it was my face. Not an exact replica, not a mirror reflection, but a twisted, perverted version of my own features, as if something had tried, really tried, to recreate my image but had failed, its eyes too hollow, its skin waxy and stretched too tightly over bones that didn't fit together quite right. Its mouth, God, its mouth, was split open in a grin that stretched impossibly wide, curling at the edges as though something inside it was pulling the skin too far, too tight, exposing far too many teeth. I didn't have time to process the impossible wrongness of it because the instant our eyes met, it moved. 1 second it was standing at the far end of the room, head cocked in observation, and in the blink of an eye, it was right in front of me, its hand snapping toward my throat with a speed that defied reality. I stumbled back, my legs giving out beneath me as I crashed onto the floor, my hands scrambling for anything to defend myself, but the instant I hit the ground, it was gone. No sound, no fading presence, no shift in the air, nothing. Like it had never been there at all. But I knew it had. I knew. My body still trembled from the sheer wrongness of what I had just seen, my skin still crawling with the sensation of something cold and dead brushing against me, but when I looked around, my apartment was exactly as it had been before. The furniture remained unmoved, the dim glow from the streetlight still flickered against the walls, and there was no evidence, none at all, that anything had just happened. My phone, which I was certain had fallen to the floor in the chaos, was still on the coffee table, the screen black as if the call had never existed. The call log? Empty. The text that had appeared, the warning that had told me not to run? Gone. I scrambled to my feet, my breaths ragged, my pulse hammering so hard I thought I might pass out, and as I turned toward the hallway, toward the place where I had first seen that thing, I saw something else, something far worse than anything I had encountered so far. There was a new message scrawled across my bedroom door, etched deep into the wood as though burned there by something not of this world. 2 words, simple and absolute, sending a fresh wave of terror coursing through my veins. See you. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? Every time I closed my eyes, I saw its face, my face, but wrong in ways that made my stomach twist with something beyond fear, beyond comprehension. The grotesque mimicry of my own expression, the empty black voids where its eyes should have been, the too wide grin that split its features like something wearing my skin as a mask. I sat on my couch, body stiff, pulse erratic, every light in my apartment turned on in some futile attempt to chase away the oppressive darkness that seemed to claw at the edges of my vision, creeping in, waiting. The message on my door, "See you," burned into my mind as much as it was burned into the wood itself, a taunt, a promise, a warning that this wasn't over. That it was only beginning. By morning, my logical mind tried to reassert itself, tried to make sense of the senseless, but there was no rational explanation for what had happened. My phone records were clean, as if the calls had never existed. My security camera footage was wiped, showing nothing but a static-filled void where there should have been footage of whatever had stood outside my door before slipping inside without opening it. Even the scratches on my door looked faded in the daylight, as though they had never been deep to begin with, as though my mind was tricking me, twisting reality into something untrustworthy. But I knew better. This was real. It was all real. And if I wanted to survive, if I wanted to know what was happening to me, I had to find answers. I spent the next few hours digging through the depths of the internet, scouring forums dedicated to the strange and the unexplained, searching for any thread that could lead me toward an answer, but everything I found only deepened my fear. Phantom 911 calls. Reports of people receiving emergency callbacks for calls they never made. Disappearances. Patterns of individuals vanishing without a trace after claiming something was watching them, mimicking them, hunting them through the phone lines. And then I found it, a post from 2 years ago, buried deep in an abandoned thread, written by someone who had experienced exactly what I had. Their description was chillingly familiar, the distorted calls, the messages appearing and disappearing, the sense of being followed, being watched, being studied. But the post ended abruptly, cut off mid-sentence, and when I clicked on their profile, my blood turned to ice. User not found. It was like they had never existed at all. I sat in front of my laptop, the glow of the screen casting flickering shadows across the walls, my fingers hovering over the keyboard as the weight of what I had just discovered settled deep into my bones, coiling around my lungs like something alive, something waiting for me to acknowledge it fully. The post, the one that mirrored my exact experience, had been deleted, scrubbed from the internet like it had never existed, and yet, I had seen it, read it, absorbed every word like an echo of my own unraveling nightmare. My thoughts spiraled in frantic loops, questions crashing into one another, fear curling around each one like a parasite, feeding on my doubt, my terror, my need to understand. What had happened to that person? Were they still out there somewhere, hiding, running? Or had they vanished the same way their words had? The same way my 911 calls had erased themselves. My pulse throbbed in my skull, a deep, hammering beat that drowned out reason, and then, my phone rang. The sound sent a jolt of pure adrenaline through my body, my muscles locking up as my eyes darted to the glowing screen. Unknown caller. My throat tightened, fingers twitching at my sides, my body caught between the desperate urge to answer and the equally desperate urge to throw the phone against the wall and pretend it wasn't happening. But the ringing wouldn't stop. Wouldn't let me ignore it. Each shrill tone scraped against my nerves like nails on glass, each second stretching into eternity, and with a breath that shook through my entire frame, I answered. The silence on the other end was deafening, an abyss of soundlessness that made my skin prickle with the sensation of something waiting, something listening. And then, in that void, a whisper crawled through the speaker, slow and deliberate, the voice warped, wrong, so impossibly close. "Open your door." My stomach twisted violently, my breath hitching in my chest, my entire body recoiling as if the words themselves had weight, as if they had reached through the phone and pressed against my skin with cold, clammy fingers. My gaze snapped to the front door, the heavy wooden frame suddenly looking fragile, weak, too thin to keep anything out. The air in the apartment shifted, thickened, a static charge buzzing beneath my skin like an approaching storm, and in that moment, I knew. I wasn't alone. Something was on the other side of the door. The whisper came again, softer this time, dragging across my senses like a rusted blade. "I know you're listening." And then, the knocking started. Slow, deliberate, impossibly controlled, like whatever was outside wasn't in a hurry because it knew. It knew I had nowhere to go. The knocking didn't stop. It came in steady, rhythmic taps, deliberate and patient, as though whatever was outside knew it didn't need to force its way in, that it could simply wait, that eventually, I would be the one to break. Each knock sent tremors through my spine, my breath locked in my chest as I stared at the door, waiting, expecting something worse. My fingers clenched into fists at my sides, nails biting into my palms as my mind raced through 1,000 possible explanations, 1,000 possible ways out. But the truth was, I had none. I had already crossed into something far beyond logic, something I couldn't escape no matter how hard I tried. The air around me had thickened, warped, as if the walls themselves were pressing inward, suffocating me in a silence that felt impossibly vast, endless, stretching beyond the boundaries of my own reality. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the knocking stopped. A void of sound swallowed the apartment, more terrifying than the noise had been, more unnatural, more wrong. My phone, still clutched in my hand, was eerily silent, the call still connected, but the breathing on the other end was gone. I hesitated, swallowing hard, my fingers shaking as I slowly brought the phone back to my ear, and then, just as my lips parted to whisper, to ask if anyone was still there, the voice returned. But this time, it wasn't whispering. This time, it was laughing. The sound was distorted, fractured, inhuman, as if 100 voices were speaking at once, layering over each other in a cacophony of garbled noise that made my stomach churn and my vision blur. It wasn't laughter in any normal sense, it was mocking, cruel, jagged with something that wasn't supposed to exist. My body jerked violently at the sound, my pulse hammering against my ribs as the lights in my apartment flickered, dimmed, and then cut out entirely. The darkness that followed wasn't just the absence of light, it was heavy, thick, alive, pressing in from all sides like something tangible, something waiting to consume me. And then, through that endless black, through the horror that had taken hold of my home, my mind, my reality, I saw it again. Not outside the door. Inside. The darkness wasn't just an absence of light, it was something alive, something thick and pulsating, pressing against my skin like a living entity, filling my lungs with its weight as if trying to swallow me whole. My fingers trembled as I reached for my phone, the only remaining source of light, but the screen had gone black, its surface cold, lifeless, dead. The laughter from the call still rang in my ears, an echo of something not meant for human comprehension, layered with voices that overlapped, distorted, bleeding into one another as though reality itself was fracturing around me. My heartbeat pounded against my ribs, so loud it nearly drowned out the sound of the shuffling steps now moving inside my apartment. Not outside. Not behind the door. Inside. A slow, deliberate movement crept from the hallway, each step too light, too unnatural, too calculated to be human, yet undeniably there, something dragging itself forward, something shifting through the thick, suffocating dark. My breath came out in shallow gasps, my limbs locked in place as my body teetered between fight and flight, and then, it spoke. The same voice I had heard over the phone, the same tone I had recognized as my own, but wrong, twisted, warped beyond recognition. "Why did you open the door?" The whisper slithered through the black, curling around me like fingers pressing against my throat, and my stomach twisted violently because I hadn't. I hadn't opened the door. But something had. My gaze darted toward the front entrance, and my blood turned to ice. It was open. Just slightly, just enough for a sliver of the hallway's dim light to bleed into the void that had overtaken my home, just enough for me to see the shadow standing there, waiting. Not a person, not a figure, but something darker than the dark itself, something shifting, pulsing, bending the air around it like a black hole sucking reality into its depths. And as my eyes locked onto its shape, its twisted, flickering limbs, its face, or lack thereof, I realized the truth. This wasn't just something watching me. It was something replacing me. My existence had already begun to unravel, my presence thinning in the fabric of reality like thread being pulled from a fraying tapestry, and the longer I stood there, frozen, caught in the horror of knowing, the more I felt it. I was fading. And whatever stood in the doorway, whatever had come through that call, whatever had whispered my own words back to me in twisted mockery, it was taking my place. The air around me shifted, a pulse of something unseen, something ancient, something wrong, rippling through the room as though the fabric of reality itself had been disturbed, as though something had entered that was never meant to exist in this world. My body felt weightless, as if the gravitational pull that had always tethered me to this plane was beginning to weaken, dissolve, unravel like a thread pulled from a fraying tapestry. The darkness behind me pulsed and warped, twisting the space around it, something living, something breathing, something aware. The thing in the doorway, the thing that looked like me, but wasn't me, had stopped moving. It no longer shifted between states of being, no longer flickered like a broken signal between two separate realities. It had settled. It had taken shape. And as my eyes locked onto it, I felt the truth press down on me with a suffocating weight that made my knees nearly buckle beneath me. It wasn't waiting anymore. It was watching. A horrible understanding bloomed inside my mind, something so vast and terrible that it made my stomach lurch, bile burning at the back of my throat as my vision swam in and out of focus. I wasn't supposed to have seen it. Whatever it was, whatever had crept through my phone line, whatever had whispered in my ear, whatever had slipped through the gaps in the world, it had been searching for a host, an opening, a vessel. And I had answered. I had let it in. I had listened. My hands trembled as I clenched them into fists, my nails biting into my palms, the pain grounding me, reminding me that I was still here, still real, still, alive. But for how long? Because I could feel it now, that slow, creeping sensation beneath my skin, like something moving just beneath the surface, something seeping into the cracks of my being, replacing me piece by piece, thought by thought. Then, my phone rang. The shrill tone cut through the suffocating silence like a knife, slicing through the weight pressing against me, jolting me back into my own body, my own self. My gaze snapped to the screen, and what I saw made my entire body seize with terror, every nerve in my body screaming for me to drop the phone, run, escape, do anything but answer. But it was too late. Because on the screen, flashing in bold, inescapable letters, was a name that should not, could not, be calling me. A name that did not belong to anyone else. My own. The call was coming from my number. The same number I had always had. The same number the 911 operator had said had dialed her in the first place. And then, as my trembling hand hovered over the screen, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps, I saw something even worse. My reflection, on the blackened surface of my phone screen, wasn't following my movements. It was smiling. And just as I realized that the thing in the doorway, the thing wearing my form, had disappeared, just as the ringing stopped on its own, Just as the world around me began to flicker like a failing signal, the screen lit up with a final message, one that carved itself into my brain with an unbearable finality. "You're the Echo now." And then, before I could scream, before I could resist, before I could fight, everything went black.